Folks, big things are happening and I will tell you all about it. In this video, we're going to take a look at everything that we know so far about Europa Universalis V, a game that hasn't been announced yet, but basically everybody knows it's coming. I will tell you everything that you need to know when it comes to the details of what we know so far, what we can expect, and what the open questions are. I will cover everything that has been covered by the devs in their proper devs posts so far, but also in devs comments left elsewhere on the forum. So make sure to sit down and let's take a look at what Studio Tinto down in Barcelona is cooking. Now for starters, let's get the basics right. EU5 has not yet been announced officially, but it is incredibly safe to say that the game that is currently being talked about by Paradox Tinto, their new studio down in Spain, headed by Johan Andersson, is indeed producing this game. Paradox Tinto is in charge of Europa Universalis V and is indeed also headed by the person that is essentially the father of Europa Universalis. They are currently working on something they call Project Caesar and have started talking about it in the forums. So far we have received 3 devs posts and all of them had quite a bit of insight already. Now I do really want to stress that these aren't technically speaking dev diaries, they're called Tinto Talks, and they're not technically for Europa Universalis V, but well, it's basically confirmed in all but name. We have absolutely no details related to, for example, the release date or when to expect the official announcement, but we have already seen a lot when it comes to the studio philosophy, but also to much more firm gameplay elements, especially related to the map. In the very first Tinto Talks dev diary, Johan Andersson talked about the topic of the game design in general, and this was incredibly interesting, especially if you were around when Imperator Rome came out and if you were around long before that, for example for Hearts of Iron 2 and so on. What he specifically pointed out is that he has changed his approach. First of all, Hearts of Iron 4 of course was announced long before it was actually released and, well, back then it looked a lot different from the actual release version. That game essentially was announced too early. Since then, Paradox doesn't announce anything, more than about 6 or 7 months before the actual release date when it comes to grand strategy games. For Project Caesar, however, the people behind Studio Tinto said we want to get more feedback, because not only does the lesson from Hearts of Iron 4 exist, where you shouldn't announce it too early, but also the lesson, of course, from the infamous game Imperator Rome. Imperator Rome doubtlessly could have done with a lot more feedback from the community, since it, well, came out in a pretty polished state, very much playable, but in a state that basically most people just did not enjoy. This is something they desperately want to avoid for this game, and it makes a lot of sense if you think about it. It would take too much time to really go into the details here, but Europa Universalis V has a very difficult time ahead of itself, even if it turns out to be an incredibly good game. It's not like EU5 is going to come out and just stand on its own. No, it proactively has to compete for the attention of its player base against EU4, which is, in all fairness, a massive content behemoth. Whether you are enjoying it, whether you think that it went too far or it didn't go far enough when it comes to mission trees or other mechanics, well, one thing is clear, EU4 has a lot going on, and EU5 as a new game will of course not be quite as dense and busy, so it is all the more important that this game gets the basics very right, and that is exactly what they are focusing on right here. One thing that they are focusing on are these 3 aspects in particular. They want to create a believable world that comes with a ton of immersion and I think most importantly with a ton of replayability. Their goal here is to create a world where you want to dive into it and return over and over again. Of course that is easier said than done. Everybody wants to make a great and replayable game. However, they are already taking plenty of steps that will make this game stand out compared to EU4. For example, what is already confirmed is that there will be no mana, and that is a massive 180. Listen, I personally always had a ton of respect for Johan Andersson, because when I was in Berlin in 2019, he actually held a talk about Imperator Rome and specifically said there were mistakes made. This shouldn't have been released this way and he took the blame for it. That is a really massive step to do, especially in an industry like this one. Back in the day, he also said that basically every game going forward by Paradox will probably feature mana, and all of a sudden this key project of his finds himself in the other corner of the fight. That is very interesting and most certainly implies that there were a ton of lessons learned. 1 week after these initial facts, they went much further. Whereas the very first dev diary was incredibly vague and wanted a lot of feedback on whether this direction in general was good, the second one was a lot more specific and a lot further developed, because we are also getting a ton of good images here. This one was about maps. The very first question when it comes to the map, especially a worldwide map, is of course what the projection should be. In this case, they they went with the GAL stereographic projection. Very different from the Mercator projection, this projection keeps the continents roughly in shape and size, meaning that you will have a realistic world map in front of you. However, it does of course also preserve detail in certain areas while not making them too big, like for example Europe, which for Europa Universalis is pretty important. Now before we go on here and take a good look at the other screenshots, I mean just look at this map. This is an incredibly detailed map, which really doesn't surprise me. Johan says elsewhere also that this is indeed something that works on the very basis of Imperator Rome's map, and Imperator Rome arguably is one of the most beautiful maps in the business. You can see a whole lot of wasteland here. You can see very specific movement points from, for example, Africa to the Americas, and you can see incredible potential for detail all around on the map in general, which, well, isn't a surprise. If you've played Imperator Rome, which you should, by the way, because it is currently the Imperator Rome weekend number 2, then you will know that there are incredibly small and incredibly detailed provinces as members of a region and so on. This is just the next logical step after Imperator Rome, of course. To go into it in greater detail, the smallest subdivision is called a location. Then, many locations make up a province, a group of provinces is an area, and a group of areas is called a region, and a group of regions is called a subcontinent, and from there, of course, we have a continent. For example, if we take the home of Paradox Interactive, it is located in the location Stockholm, which is in the province of Uppland, which is in the Svealand area, which is in the Scandinavia region, which is in Western Europe, and that is, of course, on the continent called Europe. What is very apparent here, I think already, that this will be an unbelievably detailed map, which makes a lot of sense because Europa Universalis is a series about exploration, a series about taking tiny provinces to establish your trade outposts to, then of course later on create your colonial empire with. We can also see right here that this map looks relatively barren. I'm not sure whether this is the final product, I assume that it isn't, but there is already a pretty interesting style here, and that is of course the paper map graphics that you can see, for example, with the tree lines. Additionally, we can see some kind of striped line. I would assume that maybe these are roads. I mean, honestly, we have roads already in Imperator Rome and it was such a fun system, really building up your empire as you go. I would not be surprised if roads would play a focus here as well. The vision of Paradox Tinto is to make provinces as historical as possible when it comes to borders, while trying to keep the size of the locations consistent, with a more or less regular progression from the smallest to the biggest, with a rule of thumb being that a location shouldn't have more than 3 times the number of pixels compared to a neighboring one. This is pretty unique because, well, normally if you, for example, take a look at Siberia, you will see that those locations are much bigger than anywhere else. Very nice to see that all of a sudden we're seeing something that is pretty uniform worldwide. Now, the smallest subdivision, as mentioned, a location can come in 4 different types. The first type of location is of the more uniform size. For a land location, this would be the normal location that can be settled, and for sea locations, this would be a coastal sea location, or any location adjacent to a coastal sea location. You can see it right here in this screenshot. You can also see, of course, that you can traverse from these coastal areas over the sea only in particular areas. This is a second type and is called the sea current location, which connects coastal areas with each other, allowing to travel faster in one direction, according of course to the currents and the wind. This is super goddamn cool. Having really the open sea going on is not something that happened historically. It wasn't like you just went into the next sea tile and then hoped to hop into the next sea tile where there's land. Instead, you would go with the currents, with the wind and so on, or most of the time just along the coastline. Seeing this implemented here is really good because, well, yeah, going back and forth from Europe should be a challenge, and in this case it will be one via the currents. I'm also quite interested in what this will look like gameplay-wise, because EU4, for example, has a lot of automated fleet movement already. I could, for example, see that within one of those sea currents, similar to how you can protect trade in a particular area in EU4, you could do piracy in the sea current only, which, yeah, that is what they did historically. Now, the third type of locations is what is called impassable wasteland, which can be used to describe parts of the Sahara, Greenland, or other places where hardly any people live. This is also what the empty areas in oceans are. You can't enter them, you can't leave them, they are there to essentially just be blockers. And then last but not least, there are so-called passages. These are land locations that cannot be settled by anyone, but can still be traversed by an army with some insanely heavy attrition, or allow trade to pass through. Think of passages across the Saharan desert. We can also see this specifically here, of course, in this particular screenshot. And now when it comes to this map dev diary, here comes the most exciting part, I think, at least for me personally, last. And that is that they are going all in when it comes to what a location can be. In Project Caesar, they are taking a deep look at how they did things in Victoria 2, where they had split terrain into topography and vegetation. And they're going to take it one step further. There are 3 different values for each location in the world. There's a climate, for example, arid, Arctic, continental, and so on. There's topography, so flatland, hills, mountains, and so on. And then last but not least, there is vegetation, so forest, woods, farmlands, and desert. This should make it so that where your armies are, how you build up your region will truly differ, because you may have hills in, for example, Brazil and in Europe, but they will fundamentally be different based on how many people live there, so whether they are farmlands or not, and of course what the actual climate is. This should impact everything from the economy, from population, and yes, spoilers for later in the video, there is population in this game, and of course also for warfare, as challenging somebody in a city should be a lot harder and a lot more costly than challenging somebody on open plains. Later on, Johan also confirmed that one province will hold, on average, between 4 to 8 locations, so that is what you can roughly expect right there. Now, the last interesting thing when it comes to this thread right here from my point of view was this right there. Locations will be the smallest unit of land. Will borders follow them or just use provinces, like in EU4 or HOI4? If borders can go along any location, that would be great, but would there be things in place to stop border go? Borders will follow locations. How we solve border go is something you'll learn about in late Q2 if my schedule does not change. This is interesting because, well, this is essentially how Imperator Rome also does it. You can, theoretically, in peace deals just demand provinces, so for example just one city or one rural area. Most of the time you will take what the entire state is made up of, but yeah, you can do your borders by locations. Quite interesting because, my god, that is an incredible level of detail in there. Alright, so we have now so far talked about the general expectation and setting of the game, and as well as the game map itself. But then in Dev Diary number 3, we had a massively amazing Dev Diary, at least if you're me. I hope that you also enjoyed this greatly, because this is a big step that I have been hoping for ever since Imperator Rome came out. You have to see that I grew up with Europa Universalis 3. I love that game. I also played a good chunk of EU4. Until around 2018, 2019, I just fell out of it and never really was able to make it back. It was just too abstract for me. Then they announced first No Mana, and I was all ears, and then in this Dev Diary they started talking about something much more interesting, and that is that this game here will have population. This is also where they basically gave the game away, and it became very apparent that this is definitely Europa Universalis V. They are saying that Believable World, one of the 3 main pillars of this game, has 4 sub-pillars. One of them is population. The simulation of the population will be what everything is based upon: economy, politics, and warfare. Then the second sub-pillar is simulation, not a board game. I can't even believe that I am saying these words and that they've written them, because EU4 and the EU series in general was, well, you know, very openly the board game series by Paradox, and yet here we are. They are saying that mechanics should feel like they fit together, so that you feel that you play in a world and not abstracted away to give the impression of being a board game. Blows my mind, I'm just gonna be honest with you. And then, like that wasn't enough, they are posting this culture map right here, and this is a very important one. Because, well, what you can already tell is that very similar to Imperator Rome, culture and pops are very clearly stored on a location level. If you take a look at this, and if you take a look at the stripes, you can see that they are even in tiny areas. There's a very common problem with Victoria 3, and that is that population is stored entirely on the state level, leading to a situation where stripes don't really make sense. All of Bohemia is one state, and yes, there are of course the Sudeten Germans that very specifically live in those corner areas, but you can't really show this here. The fact that we have the striped provinces as we have them here that indicate 2 or more different cultures being present means that this information and that all of these pops are very clearly stored on the location level. I love it. It's something that makes Imperator Rome incredibly exciting for me. I really love micromanaging my cities, they're building them up, making them grander, and most importantly, of course, for example, settling a colony with my loyal Romans instead of the Berbers that natively live there. This right here is a beautiful, beautiful map to me, and I am so looking forward to actually seeing this in-game. They go on to explain that every location that can be settled on the maps can have pops, or as we often refer to them in Project Caesar, people. Most of the locations have people already from the start of the game. A single unit of people in a single location can be any size, from 1 to a billion, as long as they share the same 3 attributes: culture, religion, and social class. This unit of people is then referred to as a pop. Cultures can be, for example, Catalan, Andalusi, Swedish, or something else. Religion can be Catholic, Lutheran, Sunni, and, well, everything else. And last but not least, and this is very important, so let's take a look at this, social class. There will be 5 different social classes: nobles, clergy, burghers, peasants, slaves. This means that if you are a country that does not have multiple cultures or religions, you would have, at most, per location, 5 different people, right? Because you would have the nobles, clergy, burghers, peasants, and slaves of your particular culture and religion. And then we have this interface screenshot right here. You can see that you can very comfortably search for particular locations, like right here, Tarragona. And then we can see the particular inhabitants. We see various peasants that are different because some of them are Sephardi, Andalusi, and others are Catalan. Then, of course, we see the burghers, clerics, nobles, and so on. This interface is pretty similar to Imperator Rome when it comes to how they are depicting things. You can see the happiness, the size, and of course the general specifics of this population. Now, there are some statistics missing, and those remind me much less of Imperator Rome's population and much more of Victoria II's. Let's take a look. There are a few other statistics related to a pop, where we first have their literacy, which impacts the technological advancement of the country they belong to, and, this is very important, it also impacts the pop's understanding of their position in life. If you've ever played Victoria 2, then you will know a status called consciousness. Well, consciousness in Victoria 2 was not primarily tied to, well, literacy. It was a very important step, because it made it clear whether this population, or this part of the population, was aware of what was going on around them and wanted to shape the world to their own liking. In this case, I would assume that peasants that can't read will of course be much less involved in what they demand and what their lot in life is compared to, for example, a noble. If you impoverish a noble, they will be much more active to counteract that than a peasant. Another statistic belonging to people is the current satisfaction. If that goes too low, it will cause problems. Satisfaction is currently affected by the country's religious tolerance of their religion, their cultural view of the primary culture, the status of their culture, general instability in the country, several things that they cannot talk about yet, and of course specially scripted circumstances. This in particular sounds good. I really like this. It sounds simplistic enough that you can emulate this for 4, maybe 500 years, and well, it also, quite frankly, sounds quite a bit like what was going on in Imperator Rome when it comes to satisfaction right there. So that means we have a rough understanding of how this might work. There are also indirect values and impacts from a pop on the military, economical, and political part of the game as well, which they won't talk about just yet. Populations can grow or decline over time, assimilate to other cultures, convert to religions, or even migrate. Most importantly here though, while population is the foundation of the game, it is a system that is in the background, and you will only have indirect control over. This is, well, not news, but it's vital nonetheless. Imperator Rome started out with basically this model, except of course it didn't feature something even similar to consciousness. However, Imperator Rome also required you to move your own pops, to elevate them, and so on. That was completely scratched. Pops in Imperator Rome are now basically autonomous. They do cool stuff, you can impact them in various ways, and you can sometimes move them manually as well, but it is neither expected nor something that you're encouraged to do. This is a lesson learned right there. EU5, having learned this lesson and applying this as rigorously as they appear to be doing it, is just amazing. I remember when Imperator Rome 2.0 came out, I was joking with my friend who plays, well, EU4 every single day and just plays England, that we would be playing EU5 endlessly together in multiplayer if it basically had Imperator Rome properties. And I don't want to go too far yet because we have not seen all that much yet, but this most certainly sounds like this is pretty close to what Imperator Rome 2.0 is doing, and then further. They also dedicate a short section in this dev diary whether this will impact performance or not. They are saying that you will basically not feel it, which quite frankly I believe them. When I take a look at Victoria 3, obviously that is a huge pain point right now, but Imperator Rome on the other hand never had this problem. And this system clearly morphs Imperator Rome's pops to be closer to Victoria 2's via consciousness and so on. which should mean that they are simple enough to keep the game running even into the endgame, while still giving you complexity to be attractive for this time span. Beyond that, they have also published this right here, a screenshot of a makeup of a particular province. You can see a lot of Greek, you can see Orthodoxy, interestingly enough also Bogomalism, which, well, is a heresy that fell out of fashion around in the 15th century. This screenshot was the very first thing that people were using to say, okay, wait a minute, when does this game actually start? EU4, if you weren't aware, starts in 1444. But of course, that doesn't need to be the case. EU3, after various expansions, starts in 1399. If we take a look at Mayo and Texas, you are looking at 1356, which I believe is the year of the Golden Bull. Now, I think that this game doesn't start in any of these years. I have basically two guesses. When we take a look at this map right here, we can see a big continuous landmass taking control of India. This is very likely the Delhi Sultanate. And the Delhi Sultanate wasn't this big after around 1348. So from my point of view, there are two logical starting points that seem very, very likely. The first one, and the more likely one in my opinion, being 1337. This is the start of the 100 Years' War. It is incredibly attractive and it's a super cool start date. The second one though, and somebody pointed this out on Twitter to me, is 1346. 1346 is the date that the Black Death reached Europe. And I'm gonna be honest with you, starting out in an incredibly catastrophic status quo sounds so goddamn cool. I would really be looking forward to it. One big lesson here would also be that the Ottomans would be tiny, that the Byzantines may still much more easily be recoverable, and of course that there is still a ton going on, both in Western Europe but also in the rest of the world. Because, well, as you can see, the Delhi Sultanate is still big, the Timurids would not have risen yet, and there is just so much to do. Now, I have no idea what the actual start date is. Nothing has been confirmed. Quite frankly, it hasn't even been confirmed that this is EU5, but yeah, let's not beat around the bush. This is very clearly EU5, even if they end up renaming it to make it a new fresh series or something. Now, outside of these just very specific dev diaries, Johan has also been very active on the forums in general. For example, he has confirmed that he has of course worked further and further when it comes to warfare for EU5. And for example, in Imperator Rome, there were tactics that you could choose specifically for your army, but it wasn't really fun, and he confirms this as well, saying that those didn't really work out. Personally, I hope that we get very intense stack-based warfare, because that is the soul of Europa Universalis, you can't really get around that. And most importantly, I think it would be really nice if they go even further into Imperator Rome's automation. Just because, well, honestly, Imperator Rome had a lot of interesting ideas with rogue armies, but also just with the convenience of telling your army to do whatever needs to be done on a local level. And then last but not least, he also talked about a really interesting topic, because it's basically what is keeping me up at night, not just related to EU, but to Paradox games in general. Looking at you, City Skylines 2. And that is this right here. He says when it comes to how replayable the game can actually be at launch, if EU4 had had the mission system of Imperator where each country gets many smaller trees, it would not have been a problem, as you could have had original 6 trees for France at release, then Art of War could have added 2 French trees for 30 Years' War, maybe another few fun trees for Revolutionary Era in Emperor, maybe some colonial related French ones for Eldorado, and so on. Now, I'm going to be straightforward with you. I'm a big fan of simulationism, but I have nothing against some railroading to make events interesting, to make it so that there are recognizable countries doing things that are also somewhat recognizable. In general, I actually love what EU4 does with its different eras, with, of course, everything going on with the Revolution, the 30 Years' War, the League Wars, and so on. That stuff is cool. I really like the implementation. Mission trees I'm a bit more split on, but the reality is, and I asked on my Twitter as well, that having a particular mission tree just gets people going. It's interesting, it brings you back, it makes you want to play a different tag, even if the routine of creating an empire, blobbing and painting the map in your color is of course generally speaking the same. Now he is lauding here of course the Imperator Rome mission trees. I think they are a really cool evolution, away and beyond of course anything going on in EU4 when it comes to mission trees. Whether they are in, whether this is a big part of EU5, I have no idea. But this is definitely something that's keeping me up at night because, well, this is a new era for Paradox. I would like to ask you, especially if you are an avid EU4 player, what would make you actually pick up EU5 on day 1 and play it without returning to EU4? Paradox is in a new period of its existence, where they can't just create more DLC and build up already existing games. They can't even just create a new franchise because most of the historical eras that are interesting or, well, you know, very marketable are already in a game format. That includes EU5. When EU5 comes out with population, with a beautiful map, with what seems to be a pretty interesting political and of course societal system, it still has to be said, it will be emptier than EU4. Entirely because EU4 is an absolute monster, a beast that has existed now for well over 10 years. If you are very proactively playing EU4 every single day, please feel very much invited to go into the comment section and tell me and everybody else what you expect so that you would actually jump into EU5, because I think that will be the one and only most important question for EU5. You can have an amazing game, but if you have a behemoth like that lying around, it's difficult to follow that up on. The issues that I see here for this game, although I'm very impressed by everything that has been announced so far and will follow this development both here on the channel and of course privately as well, is, well, what makes people jump from a 10+ year supported game into a new, maybe somewhat more barren game? Are game mechanics enough, or do you need a boat ton of flavor? This is a problem that I'm really fascinated by because, well, in the past, every other studio had to compete with Paradox on this level already. Why would I play some knockoff grand strategy game if I could just play EU4? And now Paradox will have to compete with themselves going forward. EU5 will have the very same problem, Stellaris 2 will have the very same problem, and, well, EU5 will have it right now. Let me know what you think in the comments, both about what we already know of the game and the difficulties that the game may face going forward. I'm excited to follow this. Again, it's not been officially announced, but let's be honest here, this is EU5 and it's looking great. I will see you in the comments, but for now, see you later, alligator.